This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Israel Institute, enhancing the study and knowledge of modern Israel, and the Van Neer Institute, promoting humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dalia Shenlin.
Every week we talk about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. As always, you can of course support us by going to tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review and becoming a patron. A little goes a long way.
Our guest today needs no introduction, but we'll do it anyway. Tom Segev is a leading historian and one of Israel's most distinguished journalists, formerly a reporter and a columnist for Haaretz. Segev holds a PhD from the University of Boston. He has published 9 books, including the one we'll be discussing today. Among those books, The Seventh Million, Israelis and the Holocaust, and Elvis in Jerusalem, variety of topics there. His books are often bestsellers. They made the New York Times Best Books of the Year list in 2000 and in 2010. In 2001, Segev's One Palestine Complete was the first title ever to win the National Jewish Book Award in 2 categories. We'll be discussing his most recent book, A State at All Costs, the story of David Ben-Gurion, published in Hebrew in 2017, and the English translation by Chaim Weizmann in 2019, published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. Tom Segev, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I want to know what the origin of this book was for you. You point out that there are already numerous other biographies of David Ben-Gurion, including by the acclaimed historian Anita Shapira and by no less than Shimon Peres, as well as the definitive biography by Shabtai Tevet up until now. Did you feel like you had something to add about his life, or did you want to dismantle myths or give a new perspective on him on the historical record up until now, or some combination of both?
The leading biographies of David Ben-Gurion have been published nearly 40 years ago. And in the meantime, lots and lots of new material, which was previously classified, has been opened, including cabinet papers and previously classified parts of David Ben-Gurion's private diary, which is an amazing document. He started writing a diary at the age of 14 and wrote almost every day until his last day. So this is quite an amazing document and very astonishing. And so I felt that in addition to that, we grew up in Israel. There was a time when Israeli history did not really exist. We had ideology, we had mythology, we had a lot of political indoctrination. And I think that we can afford to look back at our history with more, if you want, a distant look.
Would you say that this idea of having only ideology instead of history or mythology instead of history, is that unique to Israel, or can you imagine that other countries in their newest stage, and maybe not even while they're new, always try to read their ideology and their mythology into their own national history?
I would think that the attempt to formulate a country's history is typical for new states as we know them in the 20th century. Ben-Gurion, for example, was not content with making history. He also invested a great amount of time in writing history. The last 15 years of his life were actually dedicated to very, very big volumes. This is me talking about big volumes, but his were even bigger, in which he tried to inherit a certain historical interpretation of Jewish history in general, and particularly his days. So official history, as I say, is not unique for Israel, but I also think that in many countries you eventually get to a second generation. My generation really grew up under the shadow of Ben-Gurion, if you want. Today there is a generation of Israelis to whom the word prime minister is synonym to Netanyahu. Mine was synonym to Ben-Gurion. But we all grow up. We have a different view now. And so I think that it was time for a biography of Ben-Gurion.
Because, your generation specifically, but our generation as well, grew up under the shadow of Ben-Gurion. I mean, in many ways, the state of Israel was molded by Ben-Gurion's leadership and later, as you said, his historiography as well. We all think that we have a certain wholesome notion of who the man was. I mean, nobody anymore at least thinks that he's some kind of saint or a perfect man. He had his many advantages, his many flaws. When you wrote the book, was there anything about any dimension of Ben-Gurion's personality that you were taken aback by, that really was completely novel to you?
Yes, I think that if you read his diary in a way previous biographers naturally did not, because all the political information was new to them. But if you look at it, then you will discover a man who could be very romantic and sometimes
too romantic
and sometimes poetic, and a man who is full of contradictions, a man who tends to sometimes move very rapidly from deep, almost suicidal depression to uncontrolled situations of happiness and euphoria. And when you read the diary and you try to understand, so what happened? Why were you so depressed and why are you so happy? Usually it's unjustified. There was no justification to be so unhappy because Chaim Weizmann insulted you, and there was no need to devote 150 words in one sentence describing the beauty of the Swiss Alps. Yes, they are very beautiful, but you would still be surprised that somebody can be that happy about being there. So, and the interesting thing about it is that Ben-Gurion himself was aware of it. And in his diary, he sometimes analyzes himself. And he tells his future readings that this is some kind of mental construction which he has. At one point, he even writes that if someone in the future will read his diary, they might reach the conclusion that it was written by two different people. So that's quite interesting, the self-awareness of Ben-Gurion, his ability, and also his courage to write this down. So all these things were quite surprising to me.
Do you think that this was the source of his phenomenal leadership skills and the fact that he was propelled to the forefront of Jewish history? He was, as you write in the book, he wasn't an intellectual or like many other leading Zionist leaders at the time, and he had sort of an inferiority complex because of that. Do you think that, his unusual personality, unlike intellectual skills that others had, was the source of his leadership?
He was definitely a very unique personality, amazingly complex personality. And he was very much aware of his position as a leader, and others were too. And in the book, I'm trying to understand what a great leader really is. How would we define a great leader? I think we would probably define him the way Ben-Gurion himself defined a great leader, and that is a man who seeks to lead his people towards a different course of history, a new course of history, change the course of history of his people. So that doesn't mean that a great leader is always a good man or a good leader, somebody whom we want to have as our leader. But I think this would be the definition. And Ben-Gurion tended to identify himself with history. Many others identified him with history and believed him and believed in him. And I think the reason why they did that was because he believed in himself. There were also specific political circumstances that led to his leadership. One of them was that the other candidates died, one of the others, so he almost became a leader by default. But he definitely had these qualities of leadership. For example, frequently threatening to resign. Okay, you don't agree with me, I go. In contrast to Netanyahu, who constantly promises to stay.
Although I found some interesting parallels with Netanyahu that I do want to talk about afterwards. But I want to ask you that about the early stages of his life, because some of what you're describing now, this leader who believed in himself with such phenomenal force, does not seem to me inevitable given your reading of his earlier years. You describe a young man who was passionate but undirected in his youth, without great skills, no outstanding scholastic talent. He didn't even pass his matriculation to go on and study law. He had he had friends, but bouts of melancholy, as you point out, and insecurity and competition. How did he turn into somebody who was so self-confident that he could become a historical figure in the way that he did and display those leadership skills that you talk about?
I'll tell you a story. About 50 years ago, in the spring of 1968, I went to interview Ben-Gurion. And this was one of the deepest experiences of my life. I was 23, he was almost 83. I went with two friends to do an interview for our student newspaper. The 20th anniversary of Israel independence was approaching. And my feeling was that I was facing history itself, history in Jewish history in person. We found him in a pensive mood. He was sad. He was disappointed. He was very lonely in his kibbutz in Sde Boker. His wife, Paula, had just died. And I will never forget how he suddenly told us, I wanted another child. Paula didn't. And we were so, we didn't quite know how to go on. How come he takes us into the most intimate chambers of his life? And we talked about his youth. This is getting to your question. And at one point he told us that at the age of 3, he knew that he would not be living in the small town where he was born in Poland, Plonsk, because as a boy of 3, he knew that he would live in Palestine, because at the age of 3, he knew that he was an ardent Zionist.
That's commitment.
And you are laughing because apparently at the age of 23, you didn't find yourself facing Jewish history in person. We didn't quite know how to proceed from there. We still have the tape of that conversation. And you hear one of us, obviously the most disrespectful, me, asking Mr. Ben-Gurion, this is something you knew at the age of 3? And he gets very agitated and he says, yes, of course, at the age of 3, of course, we all knew it. All the children were Zionists, and we, of course, at the age of 3. And I thought that this is probably something that reflects old age. Indeed, at that time, Ben-Gurion was no longer always fully connected with reality. But when I got to write the biography, it occurred to me that maybe it wasn't that absurd after all. So not 3. Okay, but at the age of 14, he already founded a Zionist club in his town, and he and his friends began to speak Hebrew with each other, and they regarded themselves as Zionists. Good Hebrew, by the way, also to write. And he has letters which he wrote as a boy, and they are written in good Hebrew. So I concluded that Zionism meant everything to Ben-Gurion. It was the core of his personality, the essence of his identity. And beginning at a very early age.
That little anecdote, and a very amusing one that you just told, actually tells a lot about the process of balancing the subjective and the objective that every biographer has, especially someone like you who relied on this great source of information, his personal papers, you do write in the book that he was a compulsive writer, that he left mounds and mounds of his own notes and
millions
and
of words.
Yeah, millions of words.
You ask yourself, when did you have time to found a Jewish state if you wrote so much?
Exactly. And you do say that even during the most momentous events of his day, he still dedicated hours every day to reading and writing, which is in itself quite amazing.
Just add, you even refer to him as somebody with a journalistic instinct or journalistic kind of vocation inside him as part of his way of thinking.
This is one of the things that surprised me when you asked before. His ability to describe events in his life with journalistic color and talent, and some of them are very nicely, and with an ability to conclude. There's a reason why he writes down these scenes, because he learns something from them. But
but what I wanted to ask about the balance between your commitment as a historian to telling the truth, the events as they were, and on the other hand the great temptation that his personal subjective writing of history presents. As historians like to say, the enemy of biography is the autobiography, right?
That's right.
How did you go about?
Didn't know that, but that's a good one.
How did you go about categorizing the material, making sense of it?
How do I? I read a lot. I read a lot of biographies. I read a lot of history, and I give myself a certain idea of what the story is. It's a story. It's a life story, but it's still a story. I tend to think of it chronologically, and I also write chronologically. And I make an effort to verify everything I decide to use. There are lots of things I decide not to use. Now, in the case of Ben-Gurion, interestingly enough, most of what he told us, most of what he writes can be verified. Not everything, but most of it can be verified. Now, if the story is important, significant, and can't be verified, then I won't use it. But there are many stories which are nice. He tells them. I can't verify them, but they are not important enough not to include in the book. He sits in a hotel room in Paris. Somebody knocks on the door. He opens the door. There's another guest from a floor above him called Ho Chi Minh. So he invites Ho Chi Minh in, and he talks about his national movement. Eventually, Ho Chi Minh, according to Ben-Gurion, asks him, would you like to set up a Zionist government in exile? And you could have it seated in Hanoi. I can assure you that I bothered practically every biographer of Ho Chi Minh trying to verify it. No one ever heard of it. It comes from Ben-Gurion. But even if it's not true, then it is interesting that he would tell us a thing. And on the other hand, why would he invent such a thing? So I assume that it is true. But if he tells us that he heard about the Holocaust, about the reality of the extermination of the Jews in Poland, he heard that from a man called Francis Kitani, who was a Christian Arab Palestinian. And they met in New York. And this Kitani had been active in Rotary International, and so he met with many governments in exile and similar organizations, and he had been in London and talked to the Polish government in exile, and that's where he heard about the reality of the extermination of the Jews. Not that Ben-Gurion did not know that the Jews are being persecuted and everything, but what it really means, this is something which he heard from a man, Francis Kitani, as he said very often. Now, no previous biographer bothered to ask himself, excuse me, Mr. Ben-Gurion, who is Francis Kitani? You keep mentioning. So I really thought that unless I find out what kind of relationship these two people had, and who this Mr. Kitani really was, then I can't use it. And I really invested a lot and lots of effort to, and I did. I finally uncovered the mystery of the man who told Ben-Gurion, a Palestinian from Jerusalem. So I thought that's quite extraordinary. So these are two examples of how Ben-Gurion has many episodes and many journalistic stories in his diary.
I want to ask a question that's related to what Gilad just asked, which is how do you faithfully recreate the historic context on normative issues and moral issues in light of today's very different sort of moral and international norms? And I'm thinking particularly, of course, of a running theme throughout the book, which is Jewish-Arab relations between the early Zionist community and, of course, during statehood, and the evolving conflict and nationalist ideology of the Arabs and Palestinians. And I guess I read what Ben-Gurion did, your reading of Ben-Gurion as very realpolitik. You claim at one point there's not that much difference between him and Jabotinsky in their thinking, just in their methodology. And, there are many moments in the book where, you can almost cringe looking at how he views those relationships. But you can't superimpose current norms and critical ideology on the norms of the times, or can you? How do you negotiate that gap, if there is a gap?
First of all, I'm trying to define to myself what's the Zionism of Ben-Gurion. In what way are you Zionist? And the best answer I can give you to that is the quest for a Jewish state in Palestine on as much land as possible, not necessarily all the land, but as much land as possible, and a few Arabs as possible. This is the essence of Ben-Gurion's. And so then I follow his story, and obviously I'm trying to get to the core of his attitude towards the Arab problem, not necessarily what he thinks about Arabs, but how do you relate to the problem? Now, the first activity, the first public activity of Ben-Gurion in Palestine, he came in 1906 when he was 20, and he immediately started to make an effort to replace Arab workers at Jewish farms with Jewish workers. This was not a social thing. It was not that there was no shortage of jobs. It was a national thing. He thought that the land should be worked by Jewish workers. And it was called the struggle for Hebrew labor. So it was a national thing. This was the first thing he did. Then very early in 1909, he experienced an Arab attack on a farm in which he worked in Segev. And three of his fellow, or two or three, I'm not sure, right? I think two of his fellow workers were killed. In a letter to his father, which he wrote immediately afterwards, 1909, he says, "It is because our weakness, our Arab neighbors provoke us." 10 years later, 1919, he participated in a public debate about the proper attitude towards the Arabs, and everybody had some good ideas how we could improve or could design the relationship with the Arabs. And Ben-Gurion interrupted him and said, "Well, it's very nice that you all talk about peace, but there is no chance for peace. There will be no peace. There is a national abyss here. We want Palestine as a nation. The Arabs want the country as a nation. So there's nothing to do." And this
we quoted this exact same line in our question, so I'm glad that you raised it, because this is also, in a way, an acknowledgement that the Arabs living in Palestine at the time had national aspirations, an acknowledgement of that, rather than just being people.
The way he saw it. This is 1919, 100 years ago, as we speak. So what can we do? We can be so strong that the Arabs will realize that they can't destroy us. Meaning, this is a problem that cannot be solved. It can only be managed. And I think that Ben-Gurion invented that formula, which is today repeated so often. Netanyahu, just a few months ago, said exactly that sentence in relating to Gaza. What do you want from me? I don't solve the problem of Gaza. It can't be solved. It can only be managed. And this is something which directed Ben-Gurion's struggle for the establishment of Israel and his entire life. He never changed his mind. That was what he thought. And today, I think that most Israelis and most Palestinians probably share that view. It can be managed, the problem, but how do we solve it? And this makes Ben-Gurion incredibly relevant for today. It can't be more relevant. And I didn't know that particular quote before.
You describe in the book his meticulous rise to power, and as you said earlier in this interview, he became the leader almost by default because all his rivals either died or were sidelined by him. But I know that some historians like to discuss counterfactuals and others don't. I don't know your approach to it, but do you think that, the course of Zionism, the history of the Yishuv, and later the State of Israel would have been markedly different if someone else had taken the realm, if, say, I don't know, Arlozorov hadn't been assassinated or Katza Nelson lived longer?
I don't know. In America, where probably most of our listeners they know something called if history. I can't tell you that. And if you intend to ask me what Ben-Gurion would think about if he came to Israel today, don't ask me that because I don't know. This is something everybody asks me all the time.
Discussion about counterfactuals and whether we should ask them. We had a big discussion about the question you just said. We'll strike it. But I do want to ask you to go back to some of what I thought were numerous overlapping elements of the personality of Ben-Gurion and the political vision of Ben-Gurion and Netanyahu today. So without even asking you what would Ben-Gurion think of Mr. Bibi Netanyahu, one thing in particular jumped out at me, that you point out that Ben-Gurion fused his own fortune, his own fate, and his personality and his political leadership with the state itself. There's a romantic nationalism there. One quote I pulled out was that you wrote, he often took attempts to challenge his leadership as not just a personal insult, but an attack on the national interest. In Ben-Gurion, Zionism and ego blended into a single entity. And I think that if you look at the way Netanyahu portrays himself, he does very much the same thing. Anybody who's critical of him, his political opponents, are against the right. Anybody who's against the right is left-wing. Anybody who's left-wing is against the state. Do you see this connection? Did that jump out at you? Or did you kind of look at what Ben-Gurion did and not even think of today's leadership?
Okay, first of all, I think we should remember that when Netanyahu was born, David Ben-Gurion was already Prime Minister of Israel. So we are really talking about two completely different periods of time. The major difference is that Netanyahu found it all ready-made. I mean, he grew up into the state and led an existing state, unlike Ben-Gurion, who started everything from scratch. I think that one interesting thing, first of all, as I already said, Netanyahu definitely agrees that the conflict cannot be managed. I think that both Ben-Gurion and Netanyahu are probably thinking, or in Ben-Gurion's case was thinking, of the Zionist ideal, geographical ideal of eventually taking the whole land of Israel. And that's somewhat surprising when you think of Ben-Gurion, because you always think of Ben-Gurion in terms of our 1949 Green Line borders. Indeed, Ben-Gurion refused time and again to take the West Bank, and he took Gaza only for a few weeks in 1956. And the reason was that it is populated with Palestinians. Now, Netanyahu already finds a situation in which millions of Palestinians are under Israeli control. And time and again, with almost every terrorist attack, Netanyahu finds himself in a position where he has to defend not taking Gaza. Now, this is interesting that he didn't take Gaza. And I think that although this may surprise people, but I think that Netanyahu is very much a pragmatic realist in the sense of Ben-Gurion. We would love Gaza to be empty of Palestinians. But as Ben-Gurion always said after 1949, they won't escape a second time. And so there is a certain amount of statesmanship. And I also think that the settlement policy of Netanyahu, not a major element, by the way, of his... if you ask young people among the settlers, they would ask you, why are we not 2 million by now? So they are 500,000 by now. But I came to think over the years, that was not always my opinion, but today I tend to look at the settlement policy of the Israeli government as a continuation of the Zionist project, which really started in the days of Ben-Gurion. And it has not been completed yet. So, but it's really the same process. I don't really see a difference between Degania and in any place in the West Bank. This is what Zionism is all about.
You know, a number of other of the processes and dilemmas that you describe going way back to the beginning of the century, looking particularly at your focus on 1910 and 1911 when there are dilemmas about exploitation of the Jews who were brought in from Yemen to replace the Arab labor and their very racist approach to them, the colonialist approach in general to Arabs, the struggle to incorporate Haredim into the political project in Jerusalem. These are dilemmas from the beginning of the century. And yet I think about the current situation and we are dealing with the very same problems. Do you think that we have made progress on these issues? And I know that you don't want us to ask how Ben-Gurion would relate to them, but do you think he would identify these problems as a continuation of the same dilemmas from the beginning of the century?
First of all, I don't use the term colonialism. I don't use the word apartheid. I don't compare anything in Israel with anything that happened in Nazi Germany. I think
but I am
that these
quoting
are
some
terms,
of the record of how they referred to their own settlement project at the time. Sometimes they used the term colonial.
Did not regard themselves as colonialists in the way people from Belgium regarded themselves in Congo, because they were not sent by a superpower for any economic or other purposes. The motivation is different. They came either as refugees or they came as Zionists. Most of them came as refugees, not as Zionists. This is one of the big problems of Ben-Gurion, that the Jewish people, basically, most of the Jewish people, does not regard itself as Zionist. And that's quite surprising, again, in our approach to ourselves and our history. We naturally assume that Judaism and Zionism is the same thing. It's not. But they did not regard themselves, they did not have the same motivation as the British in India or the French in Algeria or anything like that. So that's, I think, the important thing. I think that there is a certain linguistic problem here that they did say in English, the colonialist movement, really meaning the settlement movement. But if you say today settlement, that's also problematic. So, but I think we understand what we mean. They came here to live here. And so I think there is a basic difference between the Zionist movement and the classical colonialism.
I was asking whether you think he would see the continuity in some of the dilemmas about how to deal with, again, their approach to Arabs, their approach to Mizrahi Jews in particular. There's a particular moment when you focus on the racism involved in bringing Yemenite Jews. You don't call it racism, but I mean the attitudes expressed.
No, racism.
And then, of course, incorporating the Haredim into the political project. Those are just three of some themes that I feel like we are still coping with today. And do you think he would see that there is continuity, or do you think that there's been progress? When I look at those descriptions, they look very much the same.
No, I think that there is a very distinct element of racism in Zionism and maybe in Judaism in general. What we see today with the Jews from Ethiopia is very much a repetition of what we saw with Jews coming first from Yemen, then from North Africa, from Iraq, from whatever. And Ben-Gurion's attitude to these people is really interesting because after the Holocaust, he realized that the Zionist dream will not come true in the sense that the Jewish state will not be a European state. Zionism is a distinctly European movement, European ideology, European set of thoughts. And after the Holocaust, Ben-Gurion unwillingly, but without any other alternative, discovered the Jews of the Arab world. And was very unhappy about them, not because he was a racist. I think that racism implies hatred. And Ben-Gurion did not hate the Mizrahim, the Jews from the Arab world. He just thought that it would be very, very difficult to build a modern state with these people. But there were some people who treated them with racism. And there are many people who today treat the Jews from Ethiopia with racism. So this comes in waves, maybe, you know. Every wave of immigration has to fight a certain set of stereotypes. The Russians also had to fight a certain set. But the Russians are a huge success story, and the Ethiopians are not. So concerning this issue, concerning the orthodoxy, I praise Ben-Gurion in my book for his treatment of the Orthodox problem, and I have many friends who are angry with me for that, because today it's very fashionable to be anti-Haredi. Ben-Gurion was very much aware of the fact that there is no symmetric relationship between the Orthodox and the secular. There are some things which the Orthodox simply cannot accept. He cannot accept that his daughter will be drafted to the army. He will choose to leave the country, or he will disobey the law, or he will commit suicide. He will not go for that. And there are other things like that. And so Ben-Gurion also was very much aware of the difficulty to forge all these people into one community, one nation, and he was afraid of a cultural war. The last thing he wanted was a cultural war. And so he orchestrated many political compromises with the Haredim, with the Orthodox, some of which are still relevant today. And the Orthodox communities in those days were very different from the ones which we have today, because in those days, these were frightened communities who everything they did was defensive. They really defended their right to maintain their way of life. Today, these are very, very powerful parts of the Israeli public who are trying to influence life in Israel. In those days, they were just defending their own communal life. And so it was easier for Ben-Gurion, and in that sense, the problem has become much more disturbing today than it was then.
This conversation will sadly have to draw to a close soon, but I'd like to ask you maybe one last question, as I know, Dalia, it will be the penultimate question. No. Your earlier books were history books per se, about a certain period, whether it was the first years of Israel, the British Mandate, the Six-Day War, about historical events. And then you kind of shifted towards writing biographies, first of Simon Wiesenthal and now David Ben-Gurion. Was there a specific trigger for that? And does it entail a different kind of, historiographical exercise, different set of skills?
Over the years, I reached the conclusion that the best history is journalistic history, just as the best journalism is historic journalism. And so I think that biography lends itself really to implying that principle. And I like doing it. I like people. Also, my history books are full with stories of people. I think that history is really the story of people. Many historians think that's a very superficial way of looking at it. Sometimes people praise me for not being journalistic enough, but I absolutely love. I was a journalist for all my life, and I think that's the right way to do history.
So it was the last question. Dr. Tom Segev, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And many thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Georgia Foscarini and Itai Shelem, our producers, and to the Israel Institute and the Van Leeuwen Institute for the generous support. And I would like to ask you this. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. All you have to do is go to the ratings and review section and write us a review, preferably a glowing one. You also can support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto a Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 500 interviews. If you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. And follow me and Dali on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.